Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick and I had with Joe Saward, one of Formula One's most independent and insightful journalists. Listener Drew asked, if Nico Rosberg hadn't won the 2016 championship, would he still have retired? As you'll hear, it's a question that opens up something we don't talk about enough: what it actually costs a driver to compete at this level, and what happens when winning isn't enough to make you stay. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If this show adds value to your F1 experience, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app. Share this episode with other F1 fans. That's how people find us, and it's how we keep growing this community. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, gentlemen, we got a great question from Drew, one of our listeners. His question was, if Nico Rosberg hadn't won the championship in 2016, would he still have retired at the end of the year? And if not, how would that relationship with Lewis have continued into 2017 when Mercedes was still great, but not as dominant? So I love this question because it opens up something we don't talk about often, the psychological toll of competing at this level. Joe, you've covered drivers across multiple eras, so let's start with you. And then, of course, Dick, I want you to jump in. Joe, you were there in 2016. What was your read on Nico's state of mind that season? I mean, because from the outside, it looked like he was operating at an unsustainable level of intensity. So was winning the championship the goal, or was proving that he could beat Lewis the goal?
Well, I think, if I'm being brutally honest, that Nico's an intelligent guy. And I think what he realized, that he'd got himself into a situation where he was able to beat Lewis, but it was largely due to the fact that Lewis suffered an engine failure. And consequently, I think that Nico looked at it and went, I won't be able to do this again. Therefore, if you become world champion, it was like a week later he retired. I think if you become world champion and you know that you can't do it again, you might as well get out while the going's good. And that's always been my read of it, which is like sort of, I've done it, I've beaten him, it will always be in the record books, and now I can go away and do something else. But also because I don't think he was as good as Lewis. You know, at the end of the day, the circumstances came together for him that year and it worked, and good for him. And if luck was involved, good for him. You know, that's just the way of the world sometimes.
Do you think that I've always felt, Joe, like Mika Hakkinen was so worn out trying to beat Schumacher that he says, well, I'm going to take a sabbatical, which then became a retirement eventually. And I always thought that the Rosberg Hamilton thing was a little bit like the Mika and Michael thing, that they both realized that, hey, I've won my championship, or in Mika's case, championships. I'm worn out trying to beat this guy, much to your point, and I'm gonna ride off into the sunset while go while the getting's good, so to speak. You think that there's a parallel there, or am I just barking up the wrong tree?
No, I don't think it's really a parallel because the Mika Hakkinen and Nico Rosberg are two very different ends of the scale. Mika Hakkinen's ability was phenomenal, and I would say he was much stronger natural talent than Schumacher was. But he didn't have the same level of intensity that Michael had. I wouldn't say it was lacking in dedication, because it wasn't. It's just Mika was able to soak up more than Mika was. Mika also, remember, he nearly died in an accident in Adelaide in 95, I think it probably was. And that had a massive effect upon him. I think it taught him, before then, I think he was like lots of racing drivers, or young racing drivers, which is, I am indestructible. And I think it taught him that he is destructible, or was destructible, and that makes a difference. And I think there was a point at which, and also, you know, there were a number of clashes with Schumacher which were highly dangerous. Notably at Spa, one time where Mika went off and had a quiet word with Michael afterwards and sort of said, "Oh, we don't know what he said, but I can guess what he said," which was, "You ever do that to me again, punk?" or words to that effect. But I think there was more caution in Mika after that accident that he had. And I think that was part of the reason he stopped. Was he worn out? Yes, probably. But I think your motivations change. Some people want to go on and be a world champion 10 times. Some people don't. The interesting thing at the moment, we have a situation with Max Verstappen. He says, I'm not enjoying the cars, and he keeps talking about not continuing. My view on that is always that, a competitor is a competitor and they'll keep going because it's the top level and they like beating records. But a couple of my Dutch colleagues who know Max very well as well argue that no, he actually might just walk away. And I mean, I don't see that myself, but they do. Also, there's a generational thing because the sort of intensity on track is, I don't think it's like it was before. The kind of levels of hatred's not quite the word, but the level of bitter competition back in the day, back in the 90s, was much stronger than it is nowadays. I think fundamentally drivers are different. And the reason I think they're different is because almost all these guys grew up together. Literally, they didn't go to school together, but they spent their lives together. And that's why, weirdly, and we never had this stuff in the early days, they're best friends with each other. Several of the Formula One drivers are best friends with other Formula One drivers, going back throughout their careers: George Russell, George Albon, Charles Leclerc, Pierre Gasly. These kind of relationships just didn't happen before. And I think that that's made Formula One drivers, I wouldn't say they're exactly mellow, because they're not, but they're a little more mellow than they used to be.
Yeah, they don't have quite the edge, maybe.
No, I
The
don't think they're still very competitive, but they don't have that sort of level of almost distressed hatefulness or something like that. I'm looking for words to try to explain it, but that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to say. I just think they're maybe a bit more rounded than they were before, whereas before it was just, tunnel vision.
I was very fortunate to be friendly with an American journalist named Robin Miller. I don't know if you knew Robin or not.
Yeah.
And I really, really like that guy. And one of his favorite saying about racing is that hate is good. and, and it's good for the fans, as only Robin could say it, right? And I think that that's a little bit about what you're kind of pointing to. Senna and Prost, they were not mates.
Well, now that's the weird thing, you see, because they had a lot of stuff. They were originally not against one another, and then they had things that happened on track where they didn't get on anymore. But afterwards, when it all began to calm down, I think in the end they might have ended up being quite matey. And in fact, I know that Alain spoke to or sent Ayrton a message the day he died, which was, and they got over it at that point. And because great drivers used to respect one another for what they were, what they'd achieved. And that kind of went away in a period of time when sport became super highly, it's to do with commercialism as well. From about the sort of when television really started, I guess, and commercialism really ramped up, then the levels of pressure on the drivers and the levels of hatred and bitterness and stuff like that grew. And I think we're going back from that now, away from that, because they live with the pressure all the time. It's a different kind of pressure. And they're more protected too. The teams protect them more.
Well, that's really interesting. So, just out of curiosity, I mean, I know Nico today is involved in a lot of different things. I mean, we see him on some of the F1 broadcasts, and I think he's got like a karting academy. What else is he doing, or do you know?
He's doing a lot of stuff in investment funds, private equity, things like that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I can't remember what it was. I read something recently where he announced that he'd put together some deal, but not in racing, but outside racing. And so I think that's what he does, basically. He just takes what money he has and makes it into more money, which is smart. And he has a family life, which seems to be fairly active, which is good for him. Often that was one of the things that racing drivers didn't have because of what they did. And I think Formula One is not a great place for life-work balance. And I think that you have to allow for that. So I think some people do quit early, and perhaps they should, and others go on perhaps longer than they should. But that's kind of human nature in lots of ways. It depends what you want. And if you've become a world champion and you've made millions and millions and millions, and you don't need to prove yourself, and you don't need to be rich anymore, it does change your view a little bit.
Yeah, it does.
I don't know. I've never been a world champion, and I haven't been rich either. So, but I kind of understand it.
Yeah, I can see it. For some people, I would imagine that it's the love of the game. And then for others, it's sort of like, yep, I've proven my point. I'm going to go do something else. Obviously Nico, he landed in that second category there. Sabrina, you're busy taking notes. What are you thinking?
Well, I had my questions that I'd kind of thought through of where I wanted this direction of the conversation to kind of go to make sure that we were unpacking Drew's question well. But now listening to you guys, I'm rapidly taking my notes to see just some of my own thoughts and processing what you guys said. I mean, because especially this idea of young drivers growing up together and then now they're at the pinnacle and competing against each other, and what does that psychological toll take? I think that's a new precedent, as you said, Joe. And so what does that mean of what we'll start to see moving forward in the sport of more of these competitors having grown up with one another? How does that shape what we will see both in their on-track performance as well as their decision of their longevity when you know that now more than ever the financial investment in these racers are so high? I guess I'm trying to think more forward casting than retroactively looking back to the Nico Hamilton rivalry. And that's just because I'm always wondering what we ask of these racers who are doing it. What is the toll that it's taking on them? And where is that pressure point that it breaks them in a direction that we don't want to? So, Joe, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the best way of explaining this is I don't think it'll change a lot because I think the mentality that exists now will continue to, because kids are going to go on growing up together the way things are at the moment. So that's the one thing. How does that impact on things? I went around a few years ago before they were all famous and asking the question. I think they were in Formula 2 at the time, most of them. And I went around asking the question, who's better, Charles Leclerc or Alex Albon? Because I'd heard both things. And I got different answers from people who'd known them in racing when they were growing up. And it was about 50-50. And I thought, that's really weird. And I went to see Esteban Ocon, who knew them both. And he said, well, that's easy to answer. And I said, well, what's the answer? He said, well, you tell me who told you what. And then I said, well, George said this. And such and such said this. And as we went through there, he said, well, George, there's a problem there between him and Charles because there was a girl at some point along the way and they fell out. And then there was, and he said, then there was a problem between X and Y because they collided. And that's why he says it's a bad thing. And so they know each other inside out. And he said at one point, he said, yeah, and Alex actually broke my finger once. I don't think he ever knew he had. He just drove over the top of me and broke my finger, but I never told him. They're so used to each other and they're so living in each other's pockets. Now, they do fall out. Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon were best friends at the age of 8 and fell out at the age of 11. And they're still kind of enemies today. I mean, it's so interrelated. If I remember correctly, just to give you an idea, Esteban got his first kart from Pierre's brother when he was 6 or something. We're talking about lives that are interrelated, a bit like spaghetti. And so they just know each other really well. And sometimes they're friends and sometimes they're enemies. So much of hatred is based on ignorance of the other person, that when people know each other well, there's far less hatred. I mean, the worst kind of hatred is probably if it's a former friend, which is the Gasly Ocon case. But generally speaking, that's because they know each other too well as opposed to knowing each other not at all. So I don't think it's going to change a lot. We'll just have different characters, different combinations. And this particular generation also is rather extraordinary because they all came at the same time. And since then, it's only been sort of 2 or 3 here. The changeover has been far less dramatic, I think. And they've been around for a bit, so you get 1 or 2 new guys each year. They still all know each other. And even if they weren't in the same year karting, they were all in the same team, so they knew each other.
So then do you think that this is a good progression for the sport, having watched how this has changed?
Yes, I do, because they have more respect for one another. And I think when you have more respect, you also race much more cleanly. If you look at when Max is racing Lando, for example, or George, they're all clean with each other. There's no dirty racing like there used to be in the days of Schumacher. They didn't drive into each other in the same way. These guys respect one another. They know what they're doing. They know how to do it. And they don't drive each other off. And I think respect is a good thing. It's a good thing for younger generations to see. It's a good thing for the sport as a whole. Nobody likes a champion who drove somebody else off the racetrack. There are reasons that when you ask people to come up with the top 10 drivers of all time, not including statistics, that Michael Schumacher barely ever makes the top 10 because he got 2 of his championships, or he tried at least. He got one from trying to drive somebody off the track and succeeded, and he lost another one where he tried to do the same thing and failed. But the fact is, he showed himself not just once, but twice. That told you all you needed to know about him. And some people idolize him and say he was this and that. A lot of people don't. A lot of people think he was underhand.
Dick, what are your thoughts? You're the racer. You were and continue to race. How does all this sit with you?
My thoughts very much align with Joe's because I've had enough accidents where I got my bells rung. Either the accidents were my fault or they were the reaction of, caused by somebody else. It was about a 50-50 split and certainly not going anywhere near as fast as these guys are going. And that respect, I think it's really, really something that needs to be there. And of course, I'm speaking now through the lens of a gentleman racer. So I've got to worry about Monday morning. So I'm going to race very respectfully. And of course, most of the guys I race with, I'm very friendly with. I don't want to see my friends get hurt. And I certainly don't want to be the guy that caused them to get hurt. And I would hope that they would race the same way with me because we all got our day jobs that we've got to go to. I've got to speak through that lens. But having said that, as a fan, I would rather see somebody beat somebody else simply because they're just better as opposed to driving somebody off the track.
What do you think, Sabrina?
Well, I appreciate you asking me because I'm struggling because one part of me says that I want to see people on the edge pushing hard, and that when you have that type of camaraderie, you could unintentionally lose that edge. And so it may not manifest itself across the entire industry or across the entire paddock, but it might for that one individual racer. If that split second decision not to push because he knows that's his mate, could that start a spiral effect on them? But then the other side of me says, I love, like, because that's the diplomat kind person that I am, agrees with everything you guys are saying of this is a good thing for the sport. And I also see why it's happening because if you're starting from a young age, I was saying this to Dick earlier, like from a young age, you're spending all your discretionary time with these other co aspirants. How could you not develop friendships? And I want them to have friendships. I want them to be well-rounded individuals, know how to be around others and compete. When I know that there's so much pressure on young racers now, I don't want it to be that the friendship somehow negatively affects their ability to continue. Like, and I want them to have good racing. So I'm wrestling with this. I think this is, again, I'm really grateful that Drew asked this question. I don't know that this is the direction he thought we were going to go, but I think this is something that we should be talking about because as fans, it's really hard to distinguish one, the social media increased presence and profile that drivers have that I think are a curated image of who they are. You, Joe, have that insider access to say, this is what's happening and you don't necessarily see on the socials. And then we develop as fans, especially those who are coming in, this narrative that may or may not be true. It could be curated by the driver or the team, and you forget the human side of this. And these
Or by,
drivers, oh, go ahead.
or by the fans. I mean, if you haven't been on the receiving end, which I have, of, if you criticize certain drivers, you get absolutely murdered, particularly along nationalistic lines. You get death threats, you get all kinds of stuff, and it's completely mad. They have a view of their driver that is completely and utterly blinkered to the detriment of everything else. So they do not have a true picture at all. It's just hero worship. And that's true of a number of nations. I don't want to go into too much detail, but some of them are much worse than others. And I think that generally speaking, most countries are fairly moderate, but it is the Latins more than anything else. They just get excited about it. The Latins and the Dutch, to be fair. I don't really understand the combination, but if the Spaniards are like that, the Argentines are like that, Mexicans are absolutely like that. The Brazilians weirdly aren't. So, I don't, it's a very odd thing, but there is this sort of absolute lack of broad vision, and that creates these images in their own head about what the people are really like.
Yeah. And that's where I think as a young aspiring racer, you have to have that as a part of your mental branding package as well. Like, that's what, as I listen to you, that's what I keep thinking is any young racer needs to know, how do you maintain a friendship while also maintaining your edge? Dick, you were just mentioning earlier about a racing that's happened just yesterday and what you were watching.
Right.
Do you want to share about that?
Yeah. So, Joe, I was commenting to Sabrina that I was watching a race it was a KZ karting race down in Houston, and it was on TV, and so I was watching it, it showed the top 4 guys before the start of the race, and they're all, standing around their karts, and they're yucking it up and just clearly buddies. And then the helmets go on, the green flag drops, and they are just carving each other up, man. I mean, it's just ferocious. And yet then after the race, everybody high-fiving each other, shaking hands. It was no big deal. And, that was actually really cool to see because I was watching some of the stuff they were doing to each other. And I was like, "Ooh, I don't know about that move." It was one of those kind of deals. But so there's a certain level of respect that sometimes you just get in and you overcook it, and then there's all sorts of chaos that you cause. But that's part of being on the limit too. It wasn't malicious. They just overcooked it.
Joe, going back to what you just said about like the international social media component of this, that's what I hope that fans of the sport would take time to understand, which is why we want to have these kinds of conversations of realizing that just because you have this hero worship with a driver, that may not necessarily be the reality, and you are not seeing so much that has actually happened. Or even if you've watched their trajectory of since their karting days, you've done it probably in isolation and with limited access to not understand how that individual racer fits inside the constellation of racers that they're growing up with, that they're maybe you may not even realize the relation. They're not holding that type of animosity, which it's kind of in a weird way, it feels like people are attributing some of the more angst from previous generations of how they had these rivalries trying to create that energy that might not actually be reality that is happening today, because that's what gets them kind of hooked into the sport. But really, everyone else is kind of looking at you going, especially the insiders going, "What are you talking about? That's so not real." And that goes to, I think, some of the ways that people who are long-term fans look at the newer fans with this disregard because if a newer fan hasn't taken time to learn. I guess that's all the stuff I'm wrestling with in real time listening to the two of you. Maybe the audience thinks I'm losing my mind, but
There's a couple of points there which I think are worth following up on. One is that when you have a successful driver, you have 2 kinds of fans. You have the real motor racing fans, and you have the fans of success. And the fans of national success, if your country is good at football, then you'll be a football fan. If your country is good at motorsport, you'll be a motorsport fan. And these people go when the country doesn't have a star anymore in racing, they disappear. And so these success fans, and they tend to be quite nationalistic. They tend to be quite aggressive. They tend to be much more so than what I would call the real motor racing fans who are there for the love of the sport. And there is a very clear divide there between the two groups. And I think that's where most of the sort of hate stuff comes from.
I'll just finish up with this, at least from my perspective, as we've been talking about fans and all that. When I was a teenager, my guy was Mario Andretti. I was all about Mario. And in 1977, Jody Scheckter, and Niki Lauda got in a battle to win the U.S. Grand Prix at Long Beach. And I will confess to the world right now that for 2 hours, I was on my hands and knees in front of the TV, just willing Mario on, and he won it. And it was like one of my best days because that was my guy and he won. But you know what? The sun came up the next day and life started over again, and I was fine. And I would have been fine no matter what. So I can relate to the fans who get behind their guy, that I was equally a Jackie Stewart fan, or, you name it, Nigel Mansell. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, I just think it's really interesting where fans get so crazy that they're sending death threats and stuff like that. I don't get it. Just don't.
I agree with you. And if anything, that would be a whole nother conversation that we would have to have, because that's a loaded one. But I really appreciate, one, Drew sending in this question to get us thinking along this track. And if anything, I look forward to another conversation with you guys.
Likewise.
Okay, friends, what did you think of this conversation? We'd love to hear from you. What questions are you wrestling with? What should we dive into next? Send them to Sabrina at 2guysaGirlandF1.com. We read every single one, and frankly, your questions are usually more interesting than what we'd come up with on our own. And with that, let me say, this ends our conversation. But we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.